The cold, suffocating air inside the courtroom was filled with murmurs, the tension so thick it was almost visible. Marcus Carter stood in the defendant's box, his wrists shackled, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His entire life was hanging by a thread, and the man holding the scissors sat smugly behind the bench. Judge Raymond Holt, an older white man with neatly combed silver hair and sharp, calculating eyes, leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood. His expression was unreadable, but the hint of amusement in his gaze made Marcus's stomach turn. A bead of sweat rolled down Marcus's temple. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay strong. But when he glanced to his right, his heart broke. His wife Danielle sat in the gallery, her face soaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she gripped the fabric of her dress, holding their 5-year-old son Tyler against her. The little boy's wide, confused eyes darted between his father and the towering figure of the judge. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could feel the fear in the room. "Daddy?" Tyler's small voice barely reached Marcus's ears. The judge's gavel slammed down, a thunderous crack that silenced the murmurs in the courtroom. The court finds Marcus Carter guilty of armed robbery and aggravated assault. The words ripped through him like a blade. Danielle let out a choked sob. Tyler flinched, his tiny hands gripping his mother tighter. "No," Marcus whispered, shaking his head. His knees threatened to buckle, but he forced himself to stand tall. "No, I didn't do this." Judge Holt didn't react. If anything, his smirk deepened, as if he'd seen this exact moment play out 100 times before. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison," Holt announced, his voice calm, almost bored. "Case dismissed." A hurricane of screams and protests erupted. Danielle lunged forward. "Please, no, this is a mistake. He didn't do anything." "Daddy!" Tyler cried, trying to break free from his mother's grasp. Marcus fought against the officers who grabbed him, his voice raw with desperation. "This isn't justice. I didn't do anything. Please, listen to me." But no one listened. The judge had already stood, slipping his robe off his shoulders like this was just another routine case. The courtroom doors burst open as the guards dragged Marcus toward the exit. Danielle collapsed onto the bench, sobbing uncontrollably. Tyler kept screaming. Marcus twisted, his voice cracking. "Take care of them, baby. Don't let them break you." Then the doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed him whole. What haunted Marcus the most, more than the shackles, more than the prison sentence, more than the soul-crushing pain on his wife's face, was the judge's expression. Holt never looked at the evidence. He never asked questions. He never hesitated. Because he had already decided Marcus was guilty before the trial even began. And he had done this to dozens of black men before. This wasn't justice. This was a pattern. And Marcus Carter was just another name on Judge Holt's long list of ruined lives. But what neither of them knew yet was that this case would be the one to bring him down. The courtroom had always been Judge Raymond Holt's kingdom, and in his kingdom justice was never blind. It had eyes, cold, calculating eyes, that saw only what he wanted them to see. For over 20 years he had sat on that bench, wearing his black robe like a war general's uniform, ruling over cases with an iron fist and a poisoned gavel. To the public, he was just another judge, another old man with a firm stance on crime and punishment. But to those who had seen his work up close, he was something far more sinister, a man who had perfected the art of ruining lives. The numbers told the story. Dozens of black men sentenced under his watch. Many of them railroaded with false evidence, their pleas for justice swallowed by the very system that was supposed to protect them. Inside sources whispered about his unholy alliance with crooked prosecutors and racist cops. The cycle was simple. The police arrested an innocent black man, planted evidence if needed. The prosecutor put on a performance in court, making sure the jury saw only what they wanted them to see. And Judge Holt? He sealed their fate with a single slam of his gavel. And no one ever questioned it. Because the people who could question it, the ones in power, were in on it too. It wasn't just about racism. It was about profit. With every conviction, the prison system got more funding. Private prisons were a business, and business was booming. More inmates meant more government money flowing into their pockets. Promotions were handed out like candy. Prosecutors with high conviction rates got recognized. Cops who cleaned up the streets were rewarded. And Judge Holt? He got his cut in ways that weren't obvious but were just as dirty. Real estate deals, political favors. A quiet but steady increase in his wealth. And every time he sentenced another black man, he did it with that same smirk, the one Marcus Carter had seen before his world fell apart. Marcus had been another name on a list. Another black life, traded for money. And now, he was on his way to hell itself. They dragged him through the prison gates like he was cargo. His wrists ached from the cuffs, the steel biting into his skin. The moment he stepped inside, the air changed, thicker, heavier, filled with something unspoken, but deadly. A prison guard, a thick-necked man with a shaved head, grinned as he unlocked the cuffs. "Welcome home, Carter," he sneered, shoving Marcus forward. "You'll love it here." The hallway smelled of sweat and old metal, the walls lined with flickering fluorescent lights that cast shadows in the worst places. Other inmates watched him from their cells, some with curiosity, others with something darker. The guard stopped. "You see, we got rules here," he said, cracking his knuckles. "You talk when you're told. You move when you're told. You breathe when we say you can. Understand?" Marcus clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to beg. Wrong move. The first punch landed in his ribs, sharp and deliberate. The second caught him across the face, sending him to the cold concrete floor. Laughter echoed around him. Boots stomped away. Marcus coughed, tasting blood. Welcome to prison. Hours later, he was tossed into a tiny, dark cell, the iron bars slamming shut behind him. He barely had time to catch his breath before he realized he wasn't alone. A man sat on the lower bunk, watching him. Big, scarred, eyes that had seen too much. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man leaned forward. His voice was low, edged with warning. "You better learn fast, man." Marcus swallowed hard. The nightmare was just beginning. Ethan Lawson had seen corruption before. He had written about it, exposed it, watched powerful men squirm under the weight of their own sins. But this was something darker. The numbers didn't lie. For weeks he had been combing through case files, sitting in dimly lit offices with folders spread across his desk, red pen in hand, a journalist's battlefield. And every time he circled a name, every time he scribbled the same note in the margins, no proper evidence, no fair trial. Another black man sentenced, his stomach twisted tighter. 90%. 90% of Judge Holt's convictions were black men. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was a system, a machine built to destroy black lives. And nobody had stopped it. He started making calls. Some refused to talk. Others whispered, looking over their shoulders like they were being watched. But then he found the ones who couldn't stay silent any longer. A mother whose son had been thrown behind bars for stealing something he never touched. A father whose teenage boy had been given a 20-year sentence for a crime that had no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, nothing, just the word of a racist cop. And then there were the men who had made it out. Broken, forgotten. One of them, Charles Edmonds, had spent 10 years behind bars for a robbery that never happened. "They didn't care, man," Charles said, voice rough from years of swallowing rage. "Judge Holt didn't even let my lawyer talk. Whole damn trial was done in 20 minutes. Ethan scribbled notes. The jury? Charles laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. All white. Every damn one of them. Another pattern. Every case, same formula, same results. And the deeper Ethan dug, the worse it got. Late one night, he found himself parked outside a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. He double-checked the address, took a deep breath, and knocked. The woman who answered looked exhausted. Danielle Carter, the wife of Marcus Carter, the man who had lost everything. She hesitated at first, clutching the door like she was afraid to let go. But when he said her husband's name, her shoulders sagged. "Come in," she whispered. Inside, the walls were lined with family pictures, a life frozen in time before it was ripped apart. Her son peeked out from behind the couch, wide-eyed, gripping a toy that looked too old, too worn. Danielle motioned to the couch. Ethan sat, notebook in hand, voice steady. "Tell me everything." She did. And by the time she finished, Ethan wasn't just a journalist chasing a story anymore. He was a man with a mission. The article was explosive. A detailed expose on Judge Holt, backed by real cases, real people, real pain. It named names. It laid out the system, the corruption, the broken lives. It was undeniable. Ethan submitted it with the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing the truth was finally out in the open. Except it wasn't. The next day, the article was buried. Not just ignored, erased. His editor refused to run it. His emails went unanswered. And then came the call. A deep voice, unfamiliar. Drop the story. A click. Silence. Judge Holt wasn't just a man. He was a fortress. And Ethan had just knocked on the door. For years, complaints had piled up. Letters, reports, desperate pleas for justice. But nobody listened. Judge Holt had too much power, too many connections. Until now. Because this time, someone was finally paying attention. Not just the judge, the entire system surrounding him. The corrupt prosecutors, the racist cops, the officials who looked the other way while innocent men were locked away. And when Ethan's article nearly broke through, they knew it was time. A mole is planted inside the courthouse. A young black lawyer named Devin Ross, fresh out of law school, eager, hungry for justice. But this wasn't a courtroom battle. This was a war fought in whispers and shadows. Every day, Devin sat in the back of the courtroom, listening, watching. Every night, he documented everything. Secret recordings, hidden notes, names, dates, conversations. One by one, the pieces started to fit. They recorded prosecutors laughing about quick convictions. They caught cops admitting that they knew the jury wouldn't question them. They documented how Holt manipulated trials, how he made sure the evidence never mattered. And then they got a break. One of Holt's clerks slipped, a careless conversation in the judge's chambers, caught on tape. Proof. The kind that could end everything. But then, something went wrong. Someone tipped off Judge Holt. One morning, Devin walked into work and felt the shift. The courtroom was too quiet, too still. Holt looked at him longer than usual. A smirk. Just for a second. Devin felt the sweat on his palms. He didn't even make it to his desk before security stopped him. Hand over your badge. You're done here. That same night, Ethan woke up to the sound of glass shattering. He grabbed his phone, heart racing, but it was too late. His home office was destroyed. Files missing. Hard drives gone. Outside, smoke curled into the night sky. His car, on fire. A warning. The phone rang. A deep voice, the same one from before. Calm, cold. Drop the case, Lawson. A pause. Or you'll end up like the others. A click. Silence. Ethan gripped the phone, breath unsteady. His hands trembled, but his resolve didn't. This was bigger than a story now. This was survival. And he wasn't backing down. The city buzzed with anticipation. A former cop, a key witness, a man ready to expose everything, was set to testify. His name was Frank Delaney. He had worked under Holt's system for years. He had seen it all. Fake evidence, false testimonies. Black men railroaded into prison without a chance to fight back. And now he was ready to talk. The courthouse was packed. Journalists lined the benches, cameras rolling. This was it. This was the moment everything would unravel. But Frank never made it to the stand. That morning, he was found slumped over the wheel of his car. A single gunshot to the head. The engine was still running. The police called it a suicide. But the FBI knew better. A silencing, a message. Tell the truth, and you die. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Marcus Carter's nightmare was just beginning. He had been inside for months, fighting to survive. The guards had beaten him. The food made him sick. But he endured, because he had hope, because he believed justice was coming. Until the night they came for him. 3 men, big, strong, not inmates. Prison guards. They dragged him out of his cell into a dark hallway. No cameras, no witnesses. A fist slammed into his ribs. A boot crushed his hand. A knee drove into his gut, knocking the wind out of him. Then a voice whispered in his ear, low, deadly. "You don't make it out of here, Carter." Danielle Carter held the letter in shaking hands. Her vision blurred as she read the words. Typed. No signature. A warning. "Drop the case, Mrs. Carter. Stop fighting, or your son disappears next." She clutched her son tight, her heartbeat hammering. Tears burned her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. This was bigger than them now. This was war. The FBI agent sat in stunned silence. A murdered witness. A prison attack. A direct threat to a mother and child. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was a network. A system. A conspiracy. Police officers. Prosecutors. Lawyers. Even state officials. They had protected Holt for years, and they weren't going down without a fight. But neither was Marcus Carter. Neither was Ethan Lawson. Neither was Danielle. Because now, they weren't just exposing corruption. They were fighting for survival. The courthouse was silent. Judge Raymond Holt sat in his high-backed chair, the symbol of ultimate power. For 2 decades, he had played God, deciding fates, destroying lives. And today was just another day. Or so he thought. The doors burst open. A dozen FBI agents flooded in, their voices sharp and commanding. "Raymond Holt, you are under arrest." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge's smirk faltered, but only for a second. Then it returned. Slow, amused. "This is a joke." He leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But when he saw the search warrant and asterisk the charges laid before him, fraud, conspiracy, abuse of power, and wrongful convictions, his fingers twitched. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. Outside his mansion, the raid was in full swing. FBI agents stormed through the gates, breaking into his home. They seized hidden bank accounts, illegal payoffs, and sealed case files proving his corruption. The news spread like wildfire. Every major network blasted the headlines. Judge Raymond Holt arrested, a decades-long web of corruption unraveled. Prosecutors, police chiefs, attorneys. His entire network began to crumble. One by one, they were dragged down with him. For years, this place had been his personal hell. He had entered this room in shackles, a broken man. Today he stood a free man. The judge who stole everything from him was now the one in cuffs, a twisted sense of justice. But it didn't feel like victory. Marcus had spent years in a cage, years away from his son, years of suffering for a crime he didn't commit. He was free. But he wasn't whole. Holt's trial was fast and brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses lined up, ex-inmates, victims, families of those he destroyed. One after another, they spoke. And for the first time, Judge Holt was the one being judged. He sat in silence, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing. The verdict was swift. Holt's final sentence, life in prison without parole. The same fate he had given to so many innocent men. But there was no cheering, no celebration, because the damage could never be undone. Danielle and his son waited for him, arms open, tears streaming. He held them, but something was missing. He had dreamed of this moment, but reality was different. The years had changed him. His son had grown without him. His wife had suffered alone. His job was gone. His trust in the system was shattered. What had been taken could never be given back. Holt sat in his prison cell, staring at the cold walls. No power, no control. Just another inmate, forgotten. And yet he still couldn't believe it. He had thought himself untouchable. But the system he had twisted had finally turned on him. Justice had come. But for men like Marcus, it had come too late. Marcus Carter stepped back into the world, but the world had moved on without him. The streets felt different. The air smelled different. And the little boy standing in front of him, his own son, looked at him like a stranger. Marcus knelt, arms open. "Come here, champ." The boy hesitated. Danielle gave him a gentle push, her voice soft. "Go to your daddy." The child took slow, careful steps. Then, instead of running into his father's arms, he clung to Danielle's leg. Marcus's heart broke all over again. Danielle had fought like hell to keep it, working 2 jobs while raising their son alone. Marcus should have been grateful to be home. But home didn't feel like home anymore. At night he sat in the dark staring at the walls. The same 4 walls that had surrounded him for years, just painted a different color. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that cage. Back in that cell. Back in that nightmare. Danielle reached for his hand. "You're safe now." But the truth was, he wasn't. The system had let him rot once. What stopped it from happening again? The journalist who had risked his life to expose the truth found himself blacklisted. News stations refused to hire him. Former colleagues turned their backs. One even told him, "You should have just let it go, Ethan." Let it go? Let an innocent man rot in prison? Let a corrupt judge destroy more lives? Ethan had done what was right. And now he was paying for it. He wasn't feared here. He wasn't respected. He was just another convict, surrounded by the very men he had sentenced. The food was disgusting. The bed was hard. The voices around him were full of rage. It was a life he had forced onto others. And now it was his own reality. One morning, a guard slid an envelope through his cell bars. No return address. Holt's fingers trembled as he unfolded the letter. It was from Marcus. The words were written in steady, unshaken handwriting. "You stole everything from me, Dot. But I won't let my son grow up in fear. Dot, your time is over." Holt clenched the paper so tight his knuckles turned white. His power was gone. His name meant nothing. And somewhere out there, Marcus Carter was walking free. The final blow, the one thing Judge Holt couldn't escape, was knowing that he lost.